The Jungle Moon. Elytrax 9 was never meant to be friendly. With its sky draped in storm-heavy clouds and the scent of wet soil already thick in the air, the cadets knew the test wouldn't be easy. But no one expected the coming storm to separate the clever from the capable so swiftly. Dozens of alien students stood in a clearing surrounded by dense purple-green foliage, blinking nervously as the announcement echoed from the hovering instructor drone. You have 3 hours. Construct a weather-resistant shelter using available resources or approved materials from your standard issue kits. No external technology. A localized atmospheric event will commence promptly at cycle mark 400. The alien cadets instantly dispersed, their diverse body shapes and voices scattering through the jungle like a burst of broken glass. Many relied on their own species' instinctual engineering methods. Some began activating nanofiber dome pods from their packs. Others unfolded holographic tensile frames that shimmered blue and green in the dim light. There was no doubt in their minds. The gear provided by the Galactic Cadet Corps had been field-tested for centuries. Rain would come, but they'd be safe. That was the assumption. Only one cadet stayed still for a moment longer than the rest. A human. His name was Alex Wren, a second-year cadet from Earth. Unlike the others, he didn't sprint into the brush or start slapping together synthetic panels. He just knelt down and touched the dirt. It was soft, already saturated. His fingers curled through the muddy soil, and he noticed how easily it clumped, how water pooled when pressed. That was his first clue. If the storm would be as intense as the instructors promised, then this wasn't going to be about roofs or tents. This was going to be about ground. Alex stood up and looked at the others. A tall Zekari male with crystalline horns was positioning a force field emitter that cast a shimmering dome. 2 Velari twins, slender insectoid creatures with delicate wings, were anchoring lightweight heat-reflective fabric to nearby trees using synthetic silk. Another cadet, a squat scaled girl from Vornak, was already reclining inside a gray cube-like pod that self-assembled at her command. All around him, technology clicked, whirred, and blinked. He didn't have any of that. Well, technically, he did. His kit was just like the others, packed with all the standard survival gadgets. But he left most of it untouched. Instead, he took out a small hatchet, a roll of coarse fiber rope, and a worn Earth-standard folding shovel. Nothing digital, nothing glowing, just metal, wood, and instincts. He dragged a stick through the dirt, marking a wide oval around the patch of land he'd claimed. Then he started digging. As minutes passed, the clearing transformed. The others mocked him at first, some with words, others with amused glances. A Sarthax male with long fingers and a translucent jawbone called out, "Primitive Earth ritual, Alex? Digging for worms?" He didn't answer. He just kept scooping out a shallow trench around his oval, shaping it carefully with angled corners to lead runoff away from the center. His motions were slow and methodical, and his arms, though aching, moved with purpose. When the trench was finished, he stepped back to study the slope of the land. It dipped gently on one side. Perfect. He extended the trench there, carving out a channel that would let excess water flow out and into a dense clump of root-wrapped ferns. Then he cleared the center of the oval and began laying a grid of broken branches, weaving thick leaves over the top to create a raised, dry floor. Each decision was rooted in something he'd learned years ago on Earth, watching his grandfather build fishing cabins in the Appalachian woods. There were no plasma tents there, just sweat and rain and a respect for nature's indifference. With the floor in place, he began collecting large sheets of Elytraxian bark, slick on one side and rough on the other. He stripped vines from the trees and tested their strength. It took an hour to construct a frame, leaning sticks together to form a sloped roof, angled steeply so that rain would slide off instead of collecting. The leaves he wove between the branches were thick and waxy, and he placed them with the slick side up. Every 5 minutes he'd pause and press down on the roof with his palms, checking how much give there was. He reinforced the weakest sections with extra vines. Meanwhile, the other cadets were nearly done with their glowing, humming shelters. Some sat under their projected canopies, already sipping rationed liquid or checking data pads. A few watched him in silence now, not mocking, just puzzled. Why build such a thing when the Corps had already designed shelters optimized for every biome in the galaxy? Because the Corps hadn't designed this storm, he thought. Overhead, the clouds boiled. They rolled in low and fast, black with a greenish tint that only a few noticed. One of the instructors, a crusty Tharn veteran, drifted silently on his hover platform, taking notes. No warnings, no advice, just observations. Alex tied the last vine into place and stood back to examine his work. His clothes were soaked in sweat and dirt coated his arms and cheeks. His hands throbbed from gripping bark, but the shelter stood strong, a sloped roof, a raised floor, a drainage trench. It wasn't pretty, but it was earth-tested. He sat down inside and waited. The first raindrop fell like a hammer on a drum, then another. Within seconds, the sky opened. The alien shelters began to shimmer harder, trying to compensate for the sudden pressure. Several holograms flickered. Alex heard a distant yelp as someone slipped on a forming puddle. A small dome collapsed under its own weight. From where he sat, he watched the water hit his roof and roll down in sheets, flowing neatly into the trench and away into the forest. The ground inside remained dry. The shelter held. Outside, chaos had only just begun. The rain had barely begun, but already the air had changed. What started as a steady downpour quickly twisted into something angrier, thicker, like the atmosphere itself had turned to liquid. A constant roar began to rise from the jungle canopy as the fat Elytraxian raindrops smashed into leaves, stones, and shelters alike. Steam coiled from the overheated foliage as water met warmth. The jungle moon wasn't just testing structures, it was peeling back the nerves of everyone caught in it. A loud crack snapped overhead, not thunder, but the fracturing of one of the tension rods in a Valari cadet's synthetic wing shelter. The girl hissed in frustration and tried to brace it with her forelimbs, but the material had already begun to sag under its own weight. Her sibling, also a cadet, scrambled to reinforce the edges, but the water was relentless. Their blue compound eyes darted toward the instructor's observation drone, hoping for intervention. None came. Just 10 meters from them, the tall Zekari male stood under the flickering shimmer of his force field bubble. He was motionless, shoulders back, confident. His species believed in precision, in the beauty of symmetry and engineering. His shelter reflected that, mathematically exact in proportions, a hexagonal dome resting on magnetized repulsion pads. But water had begun to collect beneath it. The dome wasn't sealed to the ground. He hadn't considered drainage. His feet were already submerged in ankle-deep water. He refused to move. The Zekari cadet believed the storm would pass quickly, or that the dome's integrated self-leveling system would activate. But the system required uninterrupted internal calibration. The pads beneath him began to shift under the weight of pooling water and uneven ground. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the entire dome tilted. A slosh sounded from inside as the trapped water moved with gravity, soaking his boots. Still, he didn't move. Across the clearing, Alex crouched just beneath the lip of his shelter. The water rolled off the angled roof in thick, smooth curtains. His trench caught it and redirected it along the grooves he had carved earlier. The inside floor, made of layered sticks and bark, stayed dry. Even the air beneath the roof felt warmer, insulated by the compact layers of plant matter. His eyes flicked to the side, watching the others not with judgment, but with quiet alertness. He had learned long ago that storms weren't loud just because of thunder. They were loud because of how quiet people became when their confidence failed. To the right of his shelter, A girl from a methane-breathing species was struggling with her shelter's airflow membrane. Her name was Fira. The plastic canopy above her was translucent and domed like a beetle's shell. But Elytraxian rain had soaked the sealant layer, and now it hung loose and flapping like a deflated bladder. She pulled at it, slipping in the mud as she tried to reattach the suction clamps, but her digits weren't shaped for grip. The mud clung to her skin in thick clots, and her eyes, narrow and dark, began to widen in panic. From inside his shelter, Alex saw her stumble and fall backward. The shelter's entrance flopped open, allowing gallons of water to pour inside. She tried to reseal it, but the damage had been done. The interior was already flooded. She looked around, dazed and unsure where to go. No one moved to help. To her left, 2 cadets from the aquatic world of Nerun 6 were sitting on top of their submerged shelter. It had been a simple pop-up gel dome designed for moisture-rich environments, but the Elytraxian storm had overwhelmed it within minutes. Their gill flaps twitched in annoyance as they exchanged sharp words, each blaming the other for misaligning the foundation. One of them kicked the base in frustration, sending up a splash of brownish water. Everywhere Alex looked, a pattern was emerging. No one had anticipated this. The storm wasn't just heavy, it was strategic. The angle of rainfall changed every few minutes. Gusts of wind curved and reversed direction. Pockets of warm vapor created dense fog banks. The jungle itself seemed to magnify the chaos. Most of the cadets had expected vertical pressure, a simple top-down threat. None had thought about ground saturation, runoff, humidity-driven collapse. He had, and that made him dangerous. Without a word, he tightened the lashings on the rear of his shelter and reached for one of the water canisters secured under the floor grid. It was still dry. He poured a measured amount into his filter cup and drank slowly, eyes still scanning the field. A loud pop echoed through the clearing. One of the energy tents had overloaded. The blue light flickered, then burst outward in a fine mist of static and smoke. The girl inside screamed, not from pain but shock, as her stored gear shorted out. Sparks hissed on contact with the wet mud. 2 nearby cadets jumped away, splashing as they slipped and fell. In that moment, all pretense of control vanished. Cadets began yelling across the field. Some tried dragging their equipment up onto fallen logs. Others simply sat in place, hunched against the storm, eyes shut tight, waiting for the challenge to end. The instructors remained silent. No one was disqualified. No one was rescued. From within the safety of his shelter, Alex watched the unfolding collapse. His face didn't move much, just a slight tension in the jaw, a narrowing of the eyes. Not because he enjoyed it, but because he had expected it. He had studied this moon's rain cycles. He had reviewed archived cadet failures on Elytrax 9. He knew that some tests weren't designed to be passed with gear, but with grit. And then he saw the Zakari cadet, the proud one, finally stand up. His dome had sunk into a pit of water and mud. One of the magnetic pads had slipped entirely, leaving the shelter listing like a broken boat. The cadet stepped out, boots sloshing, arms trembling from cold. His expression was unreadable, pride cracked into uncertainty. He looked around. His gaze landed on Alex's shelter. Alex didn't move. He didn't wave or call out. He just sat there, dry, focused, alert. The human hadn't built his shelter to be admired. He had built it to survive. The rain had turned from storm to strategy, and now the strategy belonged to him. The Zakari cadet hesitated, then turned away. Alex exhaled slowly and leaned back against the bark wall. The jungle roared. The clearing was chaos, and for now, that chaos obeyed one rule: build for the worst, not for the expected. The 3rd hour brought no mercy. Rain became noise became pressure, and pressure became fear. Elytrax 9 did not slow down. It evolved. The droplets no longer fell like simple water from clouds. They arrived like bullets flung by furious hands. What had been rain became an assault. Branches snapped, shallow-rooted trees tilted. The clearing itself had transformed into a battlefield of water, mud, and broken pride. Alex pressed his shoulder harder against the inner beam of his shelter, adjusting a tension knot on one of the structural vines. The roof creaked, but held firm. The angled slope deflected the wind, now battering the jungle from the east. His trench lines overflowed but stayed connected, forming a flowing stream that swirled around the shelter's perimeter and vanished into the forest behind him. He moved with deliberate care. He knew that arrogance failed where vigilance succeeded. A scream cracked through the storm, sharp and female, not a cry of frustration, but of pain. He turned toward the sound instantly. Across the clearing, half obscured by mist and rain, Farah had fallen again. This time she hadn't landed in shallow mud. She had slipped down a slope behind her collapsed shelter and into a thicket of jagged elytraxian roots. Her leg was caught awkwardly beneath one of the twisted outgrowths, and her hands were slapping wildly at the mud as she tried to pull herself free. No one moved, no instructor descended, no medic drone deployed. The test had made one thing clear: assistance would not come from above. Alex stood. His body protested, his back stiff, knees wet, shoulders heavy with tension. But he didn't hesitate. He grabbed the small coil of spare vine beside his gear and stepped out into the storm. Rain punched him in the face like fists of ice. The wind shoved at his chest. He lowered his center of gravity and moved with quick, rooted steps, aiming straight for the girl without pausing to explain himself. A few cadets watched him from their half-destroyed shelters, faces slack with surprise. Some assumed he was abandoning his position. Others assumed he'd lost his mind. But no one followed. No one even called out. The storm had silenced more than just voices. It had silenced initiative. When Alex reached the slope, he saw her up close for the first time. Her skin, already slick with oil and rain, was pale with exhaustion. Her fingers trembled. The root had caught her ankle just above the joint, pinning it like a vice. She looked up, blinking through the downpour, and opened her mouth. But the storm stole her words. He crouched, sliding beside her on one knee. He tossed the coil of vine behind him and reached into the mud with both hands. The root was thicker than he'd expected, not just a tangle, but a hard spiral of natural growth. He wedged his fingers beneath her boot and pressed his shoulder against the root's base. She winced but didn't resist. He pushed. Nothing gave. The root didn't shift. Then he pulled his hatchet from his belt. She shook her head immediately, perhaps assuming he meant to hack near her skin, but he didn't. He used the flat of the blade to hammer in a wedge-shaped stone beneath the arch of the root. 3 strikes. Then a 4th. He jammed the hatchet's handle into the gap and pulled hard. With a sharp crack, the root snapped upward just enough to let her legs slide free. She gasped and scrambled backward on her elbows. Her face was tight with pain, but she nodded once. Gratitude etched clearly into the curve of her brow. He tossed the vine to her and motioned downward. She wrapped it around her waist. He looped the other end over a low branch behind him and tied a quick hauling knot. Then he grabbed the line and pulled. Slowly, inch by inch, she rose out of the root pit. Once she was above the slope, she dragged herself clear and collapsed next to a shattered drone panel, gasping. Her ankle looked swollen but not broken. She would walk, eventually. He glanced behind him. The slope he'd just crossed was a mess now. His own footprints were already vanishing into the water. The storm was getting worse. He helped her stand, slinging her arm over his shoulder. She resisted only for a moment, then leaned on him without speaking. Together they moved back toward his shelter. 1 step at a time. She limped. He bore the weight. By the time they reached the outer trench line, 6 cadets had gathered nearby, not out of concern, but because their own shelters had failed entirely. They stood in soaked uniforms, mud dripping from their limbs, eyes hollow with disbelief. One of them, A broad-shouldered boy from a reptilian species was cradling a snapped thermal core in both arms, as if still hoping it would reactivate. Alex pushed past them without ceremony. He lifted the edge of the leaf roof and guided the girl beneath it. The others watched. None followed. Yet. Inside, the shelter was still dry. The floor was damp, yes, but only at the edges. The center remained solid. The trench had worked. The roof had held. He laid her gently on the driest part and pulled a folded wrap from his pack, draping it over her shoulders. She didn't speak, but the way she clutched the fabric said enough. Outside, another section of the forest gave way. The sound of collapsing branches rolled through the clearing like a cannon. One of the cadets screamed, not in pain, but in frustration. The reptilian boy hurled his broken core into the trees and dropped to his knees in the mud. Then he stood. Without looking back, he walked toward Alex's shelter. Alex watched him approach with a tight jaw. He didn't wave him over. He didn't smile. He simply moved to the edge of the entrance and adjusted the lashings. The boy stopped at the trench line and hesitated. His pride wavered. Then he stepped over and ducked inside. The interior grew tighter. More bodies would make it harder to move. But Alex didn't stop him. Soon, a second cadet followed, then a third, and a fourth. Fira, still lying against the bark wall, watched them with half-closed eyes, too tired to react. The air inside was suddenly thick with breath, the scent of soaked uniforms and wet skin filling the enclosed space. No one spoke. The silence was not awkward. It was earned. Alex repositioned his gear to make room. He removed the smaller support stick from the far corner and retied it at a higher angle, expanding the ceiling just enough for the tallest cadet to sit upright. It wasn't comfort. It was survival. And survival was leadership. He glanced outside one final time before closing the flap. The clearing was barely visible now, shrouded in curtains of rain and smoke like mist. A few cadets remained out there, too stubborn or too unsure to move. He wouldn't call them in. The test was not about charity. It was about choice. When they were ready, they would decide. He pulled the flap closed. The storm howled around them. Inside, a heartbeat of silence pulsed through the shelter. Dozens of alien eyes rested on him now, not with suspicion, but something slower, heavier. Recognition. The darkness pressed against the shelter like a living thing. Outside, the storm reached a new pitch, not in volume, but in intention. The wind now carried sharp bits of broken leaves and fragments of bark, occasionally slapping the shelter's roof with wet slaps that startled those huddled inside. The temperature had dropped steadily, and the sharp contrast between the warmth beneath the sloped roof and the chill beyond it only deepened the silence. Alex sat cross-legged near the center beam, resting his arms on his knees. The makeshift floor beneath him had begun to sag slightly in spots, not from failure, but from weight. 6 other cadets now shared the space with him, their limbs tucked close, breathing shallow. The rain had dulled everything except awareness. None of the cadets tried to speak. It was as if the act of conversation might collapse the fragile balance that had formed between them. Opposite Alex, the reptilian boy, the one who had first crossed the trench after Farah, rubbed his scaled hands slowly against each other. His eyes, usually shielded beneath a thin secondary lid, remained open wide, watching Alex in subtle intervals. Beside him, a thin, nervous girl with amber-colored skin and branch-like antennae shivered beneath her emergency wrap, her wet fingers clinging to her elbows. She had never made eye contact with anyone since entering. Near the far edge, Farah had fallen into a shallow sleep. Her breathing was uneven, her body curled protectively. The swelling in her ankle had increased, but she hadn't complained. Occasionally she twitched in her sleep, reacting to phantom pain or perhaps to distant echoes of the collapse. Alex had given her the only dry cloth left in his pack. It covered her up to her shoulders. The shelter itself was quiet inside, but not silent. The rain filtered through the roof in muffled waves. Now and then a heavy drop would find a weak seam and spatter someone's shoulder or thigh. Each time the cadet would shift without protest. No one complained. They had all seen what was happening outside. Or rather, what was no longer happening. No more tents glowed. No energy domes flickered. No movement stirred beyond the trench. The storm had swallowed everything not rooted in the ground. Even the trees looked half-bent, their massive bodies groaning under the weight of wind and water. Those who had resisted relocation were no longer visible, and the absence of their voices struck the others harder than any gust of rain. Alex adjusted the central ridge beam, not because it needed fixing, but because his hands refused to sit still. He retightened the lowest vine, pulled the corner taut, and then exhaled sharply. The air was warm now, heavy with humidity, yes, but warmer than the jungle beyond. His calculations had worked. Every support had held. The angled pitch continued to deflect the brunt of the water, and the floor had yet to fully saturate. He had bought them more time than the designers of any field-tested gear. The girl with the antennae finally spoke, her voice hoarse and barely audible. Why didn't the instructor stop it? No one answered. Her question hung in the air like mist, weightless, but impossible to ignore. Alex didn't respond immediately. He glanced around the shelter, met each gaze, and waited. Then he looked toward the roof and spoke low, but clear. Because they wanted to see who would adapt without help. The reptilian boy made a quiet sound, something between a scoff and a cough, and leaned his back against the bark wall. Most of us didn't. Alex nodded, not in agreement or judgment, but as acknowledgement. He understood what that admission cost. Pride was a different currency during storms. Most cadets had spent all of it before the first thunder. A few minutes passed without movement. The storm began to change again. This time it slowed. The rain no longer struck like knives. It fell in longer, softer waves, more like a curtain than an assault. A quiet rhythm returned, one that sounded almost like a heartbeat, low and constant. Someone shifted beside Alex, a short, broad-shouldered boy with flaring nostrils and dark eyes. His skin was mottled and scaled like cracked obsidian, but his voice, when he finally spoke, was soft. My father is an architect. He helped design the Naroon storm shelters. He always said the ground mattered less than the materials, said structure is strength. I thought I understood him. Alex tilted his head slightly. Did he ever survive a storm like this? No, the boy answered after a pause. He worked in simulations. Then he built with numbers, Alex said, not with instinct. The boy didn't reply, but his chin dipped slightly, a gesture of thought rather than defeat. Outside, the wind slowed again, then stopped altogether. The shift was unnatural, too sudden to be weather-driven. A thick silence pressed against the shelter walls. Every cadet inside went still. Alex lifted the flap slowly and peered outside. Fog, thick and pale like wet smoke, it drifted low across the clearing. The jungle beyond had fallen into total stillness. No movement, no cries, not even the drone of insects. He scanned the darkness carefully, then stepped outside. The ground was unrecognizable. What had once been a packed clearing now resembled a shallow swamp. Shelters were gone, shredded or sunken. Some of the stronger branches had cracked and fallen. Deep puddles reflected dim glimmers from broken devices, half submerged in the mire. If anyone had remained outside, they were now long gone, pulled back by instructors or failed. But his trench still flowed. He followed the outer curve of it, checking for collapse. Some of the channel edges had narrowed, but the water still moved. His redirection line to the forest slope was intact. The structure had held not by resisting nature, but by working with it. As he turned to return, the fog rippled. A tall figure emerged from the vapor, lean, upright, wrapped in a glimmering shield suit with the Galactic Corps insignia on the shoulder. An instructor. She stepped forward slowly, not speaking yet. Her eyes, visible beneath a transparent visor, swept the trench, then the shelter. Then Alex. She raised her hand slightly, a pause, a moment of silent approval. Behind her, two more instructors walked through the mist, stopping near fallen shelters and tapping devices attached to their wrists. Some of the ruined debris began to blink, locator tags being activated. No cadet moved toward them. No one called out. The ones who had endured the night were already within his walls. The instructor looked again at Alex, then spoke, her voice projected gently through the external communication. "Stand by for formal debriefing. You are not required to explain what you did." Alex nodded once. She lowered her hand and stepped back into the fog. He returned to the shelter. Inside, everyone had heard. The silence remained, but something fundamental had shifted. The air wasn't just warm now, it was charged. Respect didn't need to be declared. It radiated from posture, from stillness, from the quiet instinct to make room when he sat back down. No one had to say he had passed the test. They all felt it. The fog began to thin as morning light broke over the jagged peaks beyond the canopy. It was not the golden sunrise of myth, nor a warm welcome from nature, just a muted gray glow pressing through the mist, revealing the ruin of the training grounds in fragments. The jungle floor steamed. Pools of stagnant water shimmered under the pale light. Broken equipment lay half buried in mud. The storm had left no corner untouched. Inside the shelter, the silence finally cracked. Farah stirred first, groaning quietly as she shifted her weight. Her ankle throbbed beneath the cloth Alex had wrapped around it the night before. She opened her eyes slowly, squinting at the light that crept through the seams in the roof. Her first movement was instinctive. She reached toward her ankle, winced, and stopped. Her second was more deliberate. She looked at Alex. He was awake, seated near the front corner of the shelter, elbows resting on his knees. His face was drawn, eyes shadowed with fatigue, but he was alert. When she met his gaze, he gave the faintest nod, not out of politeness, but out of understanding. She returned it and sat up with effort, wincing as she adjusted her position. The others began to shift in silence. No words passed between them, only soft movements, muted groans, and glances that spoke of a shared awareness. Something had passed among them during the night, something heavier than rain. Their posture had changed. Their movements were smaller, more deliberate. The cadets who had once strutted through training drills now sat with a humility earned not through punishment, but through confrontation with nature itself. The flap of the shelter was pulled back. A single instructor stood outside, tall, with polished silver markings on her armor, indicating a high rank. Her voice was level, not sharp or commanding, but unwavering. "Step outside. Line up. Bring what remains of your gear." Alex rose first, brushing off bits of bark and wiping mud from his hands onto his uniform. The others followed. Some limped, some moved stiffly from the cold. No one lagged behind. One by one, the cadets crossed the trench, now shallow and barely flowing, and stepped onto the field that had become their crucible. The instructor led them to the edge of the clearing, where two metallic posts had been embedded into the ground. Between them, a thin beam of green light shimmered like a curtain. She gestured toward it. "This is the recording gate. Cross it one at a time. Your vitals will be logged. Your score will be calculated. After that, wait by the south tree line for debrief." The first cadet crossed. A soft chime echoed from the posts, then the next, and the next. When Alex stepped through, the beam shimmered differently, not in volume, but in rhythm. The instructor turned slightly, checked a tablet on her wrist, then looked back at him. "Human cadet. Cadet Wren. Wait here." He stopped, nodding once, and stood off to the side while the rest of the line completed the check. The final cadet, the quiet girl with the antennae, glanced back at him briefly as she walked toward the tree line. Her gaze lingered just a moment longer than the others. It wasn't admiration, not exactly. It was reflection, as if something in her had been forced to rewire itself in the last 12 hours. When the line had cleared, another instructor, older, broader, his skin marked with age lines beneath an exosuit, approached. He wore the insignia of a course commander. He studied Alex for a full 10 seconds before speaking. "Your shelter remained intact. It housed 6 additional cadets. You administered basic field aid. You constructed with no guidance, using local materials and manual tools?" Alex didn't speak. He waited. The commander blinked slowly, then handed him a small metal disc etched with triangular lines. "You met the adaptive survival criteria. You also demonstrated individual initiative and group stabilization under environmental duress. That exceeds expectations." Alex took the disc and tucked it into the pouch at his side. The commander continued, "Your record will be reviewed by Fleet Command. This performance qualifies you for advanced field command scenarios. If selected, you will be transferred to Delta Track next cycle." He nodded once, not out of pride, but acceptance. The commander motioned him toward the others. As Alex joined the group beneath the south tree line, a rustling began near the edge of the forest. Several transport pods descended silently, kicking up clouds of mist as they landed. Their doors opened in unison. One instructor raised her voice. "Training exercise concluded. Report to assigned vessels. Medical checkups mandatory. Debrief schedules will be uploaded to your modules." The cadets began moving in pairs or small groups. There were no celebrations, no laughter, only low words and the sound of boots squelching in softened earth. The experience had drained something from each of them, or perhaps reshaped it into something quieter and stronger. Alex helped Farah to her feet and supported her weight as she walked toward the pod. She didn't speak, but she leaned into his shoulder without hesitation. When they reached the platform, she looked up and met his eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded again. "You kept moving. That mattered." She smiled faintly, then stepped into the pod. He waited for the others to board before stepping in himself. The interior was warm and sterile, a sharp contrast to the rawness of the jungle outside. As the door hissed shut, he sat by the window and looked out at the remains of the clearing. His shelter still stood, bent slightly, discolored at the edges but upright. The sloped roof, torn in one spot by wind, still held its shape. The trench had started to collapse near the southern edge, but water still followed its course. It was not beautiful. It was not technologically impressive. But it had worked, and it had done more than shield bodies from rain. It had pulled people together. As the transport lifted into the sky, Alex allowed himself to lean back against the seat. His muscles ached. Dirt had soaked deep into the stitching of his uniform. He was exhausted. But for the first time in many weeks, he felt clean. Not physically, but beneath the surface, in the part of him that had always watched from the edge of the crowd, measuring himself against others with tools and grades and numbers. This test hadn't measured numbers. It had measured choice, instinct, resolve. And in the end, when every plan had failed and every drone had shorted out, what remained was the shape of a roof and the space beneath it. Enough for one person to survive and enough heart to let others in.